Since industrialization first gripped Europe in the late 1700s, an insatiable push for progress has engulfed Western culture. Everything was deemed expendable at the promise of advancement. The natural environment, the health of children, tradition, and the living conditions of the average citizen were all compromised in the name of industrialization. This unsparing mindset persists into the modern world, and the unrelenting ambition and greed of the human species now threatens its very existence. Air pollution is just one symptom of Western civilization's moxie towards progress. Air pollution can be a silent but deadly killer, chipping away at health and nature at a pace sluggish enough that the problem is only identifiable once it is too late. This invisible hand quietly chokes the proletariat, shaving years off the poor man's life and adding the trimmings to the ever-increasing pile of wealth the affluent hoard. Substantial progress has been made, but it is telling that the problems of 200 years ago continue to pervade in the contemporary era. Air pollution is a uniquely universal problem. It can be easy to forget how interconnected the globe is. The Earth is more than an accumulation of parts, nations, individual ecosystems. Its whole is more meaningful and functions together regardless of man-made borders and regulations. It is a biosphere, and like it or not, environmental problems are very and frequently only local problems. As Rohini Nilekani has said, climate change and air pollution know no borders, and antibiotic resistance respects no boundaries. Bacteria from Africa can make people in America sick. The burning of Indonesian forests can keep Asia gasping for breath. Take chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, for example. These aerosols were phased out in 1996 due to evidence that they were weakening the ozone layer. It had to be more than just one nation phasing them out, because a hole in the ozone layer would affect all nations, regardless of whether they banned the use of them or not. The ozone layer is what lets life thrive on Earth, and without it, crop yields would decline substantially, cancer rates would skyrocket, and people would slowly go blind because of cataracts. CFCs stay in the atmosphere for 40 to 150 years, and on top of the already mentioned negative side effects, they have a global warming potential of 5,000 to 8,500. For reference, the global warming potential of carbon dioxide, or CO2, is 1. As mentioned, pollution in Europe is a long-standing issue. The United Kingdom was the first country to industrialize, and London in particular is famous for showcasing the worst of industrialization. Famous stories like Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist portrayed the ill effects of the greed and striving industrialization brought. It was not a coincidence that these novels were set in London. London has been historically infamous for its poor living standards. Pollution and poverty went hand in hand in what was once Europe's largest city. In the 1850s, London's River Thames was the city's 6.5 million inhabitants' main source of drinking water, and was filled to the brim with human waste, dead animals, rotting food, and toxic raw materials from riverside factories. Air pollution has been a problem in the city for even longer. 17th century writers complained of the foul smoke emitted by burning sea coal, and backed-up chimneys suffocated people in their beds every year for centuries. Those born in London were distinguished from new arrivals to the capital by their unhealthy pallor, weak stature, and a distinctive slang and accent, affected by their need to breathe heavily through their mouths due to their congested nasal passages. The skin, clothes, and nostrils of Londoners were filled with a compound of powdered granite, soot, and still more nauseous substances. The biggest cause of death in London remained consumption or tuberculosis and lung disease. Recruitment for the Anglo-Boer War at the end of the 19th century had also revealed the poor health of Londoners, when only 2 in 9 working-class males were found to have been fully fit for combat. In 1903, the American Jack London equally noted the incapability of native Londoners to undertake demanding manual labor. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the infamous London fogs known as pea soupers choked the city on a regular basis. Just one example of these pervasive fogs was the Great Smog of 1952. Chance weather conditions and factories continuing to release pollutants into the air led to a 4-day smog so thick one couldn't see their feet. It was estimated that 100,000 individuals were injured due to the fog. A cold air front swept over the city and kept warm air from leaving. Warm air rises and doesn't leave when trapped under a colder front. Warm air filled with coal ash, sulfur dioxide, mercury, and other toxic metals stayed stubbornly trapped under the cold front. By the end of the 4-day period, an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 individuals had been killed or would die due to the effects of the smog. mostly due to illness with some accidents sprinkled in. This was just one of many industrializing cities, and pollution remains concerning in several European cities. 9,000 people are estimated to die prematurely due to London's bad air alone. People who live in the city for periods as little as a year can develop asthma and other respiratory problems. In the whole European Union, 72.75% of citizens are exposed to unhealthy levels of fine particulate matter. Comparatively, only 40% of U.S. citizens are exposed to PM 2.5, as it's called. Fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, is made up of microscopic particles that can be made of dust, dirt, soot, or smoke. These particles can be incredibly small, PM 2.5 particles being 30 times smaller than the width of a strand of hair. The 2.5 stands for 2.5 micrometers. Generally, particles smaller than 10 micrometers cause the worst health effects because they're so small they can become buried deep inside one's lungs and even get into one's bloodstream. It's all but impossible to remove particles so small, and they can lead to a whole host of health problems. Particulate matter most immediately affects the lungs and heart. Particle pollution has been linked to heart attacks, irregular heartbeats, aggravated asthma, decreased lung function, and difficulty breathing. They are also the main cause of the haze that is often visible in highly polluted areas. Air pollution continues to drive a significant burden of premature death and disease in Europe. In the 27 member states of the European Union, 307,000 premature deaths resulted from exposure to fine particulate matter alone in 2019. The EU's main air pollution problems lay in PM10, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone. Ozone one might furrow their brow at. Isn't that what keeps us safe from cancer and the like? The answer is both yes and no. Ozone is important in the stratosphere, where the ozone layer is, where it filters out the harmful radiation from the sun that could wreak havoc on Earth. Life on Earth, however, lives in the troposphere, and when ozone is there, it can have negative side effects. It kills sensitive plants, reduces photosynthesis and seed production, accelerates aging, is the primary contributor to smog, triggers asthma, and can permanently damage lung tissue. Tropospheric ozone is responsible for an estimated 1 million premature deaths every year. Tropospheric ozone forms primarily from smokestacks and cars. Its formation requires sunlight, and thus ozone layers are higher during the summer and in warmer areas. People in southern Europe, for example, are exposed to the highest concentrations of ozone, because there's more sunlight. Nitrogen dioxide causes similar problems. It triggers asthma, can cause chronic lung disease, and is linked to cardiovascular harm and increased risk of premature death. People in bigger cities tend to be exposed to higher concentrations of nitrogen dioxide because of emissions from traffic. PM10, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone have all notably been well above their acceptable limits in the EU, even now. The EU has had exceedances for more pollutants than the US, their pollution levels worse than the US for decades, thanks partially to the more sweeping, punitive legislation and regulation the US and EPA have pushed for. The EU and EEA, an extension of the EU that includes Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, lacks legislation as effective as the US's Clean Air Act, and the teeth to punish countries for not following guidelines. Recently, the most they've done is criticize Poland and the UK's disrespect of the standards. There's unevenness in the air quality problem, though. The top 10 European capital cities with the worst air quality in 2021 were all in Eastern Europe. Formerly Soviet countries seem to be bearing the brunt of pollution problems. These nations, many in the Balkans, tend to be chronically unstable and unable to focus on issues beyond stability. They are unable to focus on pollution problems, and many aren't part of the EU or EEA. Central Eastern Europe and Italy reported the highest concentrations of particulate matter and benzoapyrene, a carcinogen, due primarily to the burning of fossil fuels like coal and wood for domestic heating and the use of fossil fuels in industrial production. Citizens of these poorer countries often resort to burning coal and biomass inside their homes due to lack of heating devices, stoves, and similar devices. These countries also tend to lack strict pollution regulation. Part of the problem with stricter air quality standards in the EU is the discrepancy between the World Health Organization and the EU's air quality standards. According to WHO's guidelines, 96% of the EU's urban population is exposed to unhealthy levels of PM 2.5. EU guidelines have a much higher threshold of tolerance, and according to those, less than 1% of their urban population is exposed to unhealthy levels. This disconnect shows a clear problem. It seems likely that policy changes that are healthy for the masses are being put off due to the political sacrifices that would be necessary. Additionally, European countries tend to border several neighbors, and one in the middle of a group of countries with poor air quality standards risks suffering poor air quality regardless of their individual policy changes, making them unlikely to pursue changes on a national level. Harmful pollutants are emitted in one time zone, and weather patterns and atmospheric chemistry decide whose problem they become. It would take the international force of the EU to change things, and the current standards they have in place show how low priority air pollution is for policymakers. Air quality seems to fall within the unfortunate borders of the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons can be best defined as situations where a shared resource falls into disrepair due to diffusion of responsibility. Since no one person is in charge of it, people tend to neglect or exploit that shared resource. Nobody else is doing anything for it, so why should you? Why not benefit in the short term since so many others seem to? Unless one individual or group takes responsibility for that shared resource, it can disappear or face soiling. This is the same reason overfishing, climate change, and marine plastic pollution run rampant. The US, having the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is able to curb a lot of these problems, though pollution and similar problems have ticked up in recent years as the EPA's budget and power has been slashed, and the EU lacks a similarly effective governmental body. Members of the EU and EEA have acknowledged the problems with their system, and recently there have been attempts to change legislation and the like to better organizations' pollution response. The EU's Green Deal is just one example of this. Ian Marnane, an EU expert on environmental problems, recently spoke on some of the changes the organization would attempt to implement, saying that key elements of the plan included addressing inequalities in exposure to pollution, better implementation and enforcement, collective action, and changes across society. The broadness of his statements leaves something to be desired. On top of the health problems air pollution poses, there are also economic impacts. Air pollution reduces life expectancy, increases medical costs, and reduces productivity through working days lost across different economic sectors. These problems are harming already stretched social welfare programs across the EU. Already, several nations are dealing with the threat of aging populations, high taxes, and economic stagnation. Air pollution would only exacerbate these issues, making regulation key. It's estimated that proper overall environmental regulation would save trillions annually spent on cleanup and healthcare costs. Instead of addressing the symptoms, as we've done for years, addressing the cause of many of our ailments could save both lives and money. For example, just $1 spent in the U.S.'s CDC National Asthma Control Program saves $71 in asthma-related expenses. The EU currently spends upwards of $464 billion on explicit air quality costs. And that doesn't even factor in most medical problems said air pollution causes. Stricter legislation is necessary to address the monetary, environmental, and human costs of air pollution. The gains of making change now are incredible compared to future sacrifices necessary from inaction.